Hello, and welcome to another episode of Solipsist Watched. I'm your host, the Social Solipsist, and this week I watched Midnight Run from 1988. I actually can't pinpoint where exactly this movie came into my cinematic field of view, so to speak. It's one of those movies that I feel like I've seen the poster 1,000 times, and people have said good things about it before, but I couldn't possibly tell you what those specific good things were. And in fact, I went into this expecting a different kind of film than I ended up seeing. From the poster that is most commonly shown for this film, it looks like a pretty serious sort of cop drama action film kind of thing. But possibly what's the most interesting thing about it is that it manages to balance elements of a whole bunch of different genres in a way that adds up to something that, at the very least, is pretty competent at all the things it attempts, and has enough subtlety, especially for a movie from the 80s, that none of it feels particularly cheesy or contrived or over the top. And it doesn't succumb to some of the, I don't even know what the proper term would be for this, but something about the 80s and action movies and movies in general. A lot of movies were sort of at their most excessive, not necessarily in their production, but in terms of their, conceptual absurdity, pushing the edges of what could be done without becoming unbelievably cheesy as a result. And I'm really surprised at this film's ability to ride a lot of lines and turn out competent scenes in a bunch of different tones and moods without really compromising the structure of the film either. Now, that's not necessarily to say that I think a lot of the individual elements of the film are extremely remarkable. It has the visuals of an 80s action film in a lot of ways. It has the production values and stunts of an 80s action film. It has the script a script that is quite competent to the point of being kind of really good in a few scenes, but not overall so remarkable or saying something so smart or effective or in such an impactful way that it's particularly memorable for that. And while all of the performances from all of the actors, I think, are really good at portraying not only a sort of certain archetype of character, but adding depth to those characters to make them appreciable in their own ways and not just another throwaway trope. The acting itself is not so shockingly good or bad that it particularly bears really, really important mention. But that said, De Niro as the lead role is particularly good in this film, in this showing. I think De Niro often plays just sort of variations on his own character, as on his own person. As I've said before, it's very common. But I think that there's enough subtlety and range in who he plays in this movie that it does show that, in spite of playing basically a variation on De Niro the man, he's got a variety of different abilities to put on show and the subtlety to merge between them as necessary based on what a particular scene calls for. This movie, like I said, looks more at a glance like a drama, thriller, action film. But it's actually very dryly humorous, I think, throughout. There are scenes that edge into sort of slapstick and over the top physical comedy played off of violence, which is very much something that was in its heyday in the 80s. And I think if this wasn't coming in 1988, I think if it was at the beginning of the end of the 70s or beginning of the 80s, this would have been all the more remarkable, because the 80s were filled with movies that did parts of this correctly. So I think that this movie ends up merging both the comedy and the action and the drama in a way that is paced well and the tones merge properly, but it doesn't get so into the weeds on any particular one of them that it gets particularly muddy, yet at the same time not quite good enough to call any particular one really remarkable. The acting overall, like I said, I think fits the rest of what's going on, and the actors absolutely deserve credit for playing into the changing tones. It's really De Niro and Charles Godwin, who or Grodin. I feel like I recognize him from somewhere, but I don't know where. Those two are really, as the main characters, are holding up most of the film in terms of needing to be able to show range, while the others really sort of step in and out of scene as necessary, depending on which type of scene they are in. There are certain characters who are basically only there for the action, certain ones that are only there for the drama, and certain ones that are only really there for the comedy. But in all those respects, I think it's a good set of performances overall. Our sort of second main character, played by Charles Grodin, I think deserves, while he's not remarkable in his acting in any particular way, I think deserves credit for portraying a character who is both likable and hateable at the same time. Somebody with enough subtlety to understand where he's coming from and feel like at times like he's the good guy and you're wanting to root for him and maybe feel bad for him, while at the same time, and even not even in different scenes, in the same scenes, be able to show, man, this guy's a real pain. He's really, not doing himself any favors in this, so on and so forth. So credit where it's due to both of them for being able to split that up. In most of the production elements, I think I mentioned it a little already. There are some very good elements to each of the different tones. I think there are the music is very good. The score, I think it sounds like a Danny Elfman score. I don't actually know if it is or not. And the sort of shooting style is generally very competent, but not particularly recognizable to me. It is directed, the movie is directed by Martin Brest, who does have quite a history of making films in the, I want to say 70s and 80s mostly. And I don't know that I can necessarily point out particular elements that were unique to him. But based on his filmography, I think this is pretty consistent with a lot of the other things that I have seen him in directing. In general, I think it's probably also worth just acknowledging that this is sort of an ensemble cast. While we have our two main characters, there's a half dozen others who are all recurring in various capacities, and whenever they're given their time on screen, they make really good use of it. That's, of course, down to the writing in a substantial way, but being able to, in a fairly simple overall premise, deliver a narrative that plays between multiple different interested parties, multiple characters working on behalf of those different parties, and then sort of engaging in the emotional dynamics between those parties and how they influence each other. The matrix of different relationships is played really well. You never forget that anybody in particular is there for too long. You're not wondering where somebody is. They come back in a timely fashion to remind you that they're important to the ongoing story. They have a vested interest in what's happening, and even give you some hints as to what to expect next in a subtle enough way that it's just sort of a fun thing to look forward to. And the whole thing is interspersed with just enough straight comedy scenes that are brief enough to not, drag on too long, that it lightens the overall tone. This is a script that I think, without the right balance of comedy, could have ended up being very dour and made all of the characters very unlikable, as they are all sort of it's a bunch of stubborn men, basically, is the plot. A bunch of stubborn men also all want different things and need to find a way to either come to an agreement or fight it out to the end. And that's sort of what's interesting about the overall dynamic, is seeing which way that's going to go and how. Just as a side note, De Niro, I didn't think this was from '88. I glanced over it before I put it on, and I read 1980 something. I thought it was early 80s, because purely based on his appearance at the beginning of the film, De Niro looks much younger. I think in part that's the way he dresses, and even more so his hair and makeup that's done. The balance between looking like having a younger appearance. Obviously, a lot of people know De Niro from his more recent stuff in the 90s and beyond. But there are movies from before this where De Niro looks much older, to the point that even Taxi Driver, he arguably looks much older. And that was that 16 years before? 12? I don't know. Taxi Driver is a much older film. So credit where it's due for being able to not only make him look a bit younger, but also balance between sort of not making him look too young, but still kind of grizzled, giving him this sort of nebulous age that lets you believe whatever story he wants to tell about who he is, what he's been through, and he's not just another grizzled, grumpy veteran of the police force like so many other comedy movies or cop movies of the time. To that point, the 80s was filled with cop comedies, and a lot of them I don't particularly like. There are a few that I really like. I think I've talked about 48 Hours before. I think it's great. And I still like 48 Hours better, but this is pretty darn solid in terms of balancing between comedy and drama, having smart writing that doesn't take the intelligence of the viewer for granted, and doesn't lean too hard on the comedy just to carry it through. Overall, I'm pretty happy with it. I can't point to any one particular thing that I think is really remarkable about it, but especially for being at the tail end of the 80s, I feel like it's a pretty nice cap on an era that was full of all the different genres that this movie contains, whether that's buddy comedy, cop comedy, crime drama, all these other things. This manages to touch on all of them and do it with enough finesse to be appreciable in doing all of those things. If any of those are really up your alley, I think this is worth watching, just because it's kind of interesting how it blurs things, and even takes on some of the tropes of those various things, those various genres at the time that they were, sort of ending their heydays in a lot of ways. Anyway, thank you guys for watching another episode of Solipsist Watched. I've been your host, the Social Solipsist, and I'll see you guys next time.